Well, thank you for joining. Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. This is Thursday, June 12th, 2025. Today is day 615, 615 days since October 7th of 2023. There's a lot of news to share. Some of my updates this week have been pretty robust because of all the things that are happening. But I'll start with the weekly summary as it focuses on Gaza. And on Friday of last week, there was an Israeli airstrike on the Ali Hospital in Gaza City, and it killed a number of people. The Anglican Church put out a statement, Churches for Middle East Peace put out a statement, and the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem condemned in the strongest possible terms the attack, which also injured about 30 people. Humanitarian assistance in Gaza has been allowed for the last couple of weeks, but it has remained abysmally low. Yesterday there was gunfire there's been gunfire by Israeli troops and by Palestinian militants, and people in Gaza who are seeking humanitarian assistance are being caught in the middle. So yesterday, 36 people were killed. 207 Palestinians were wounded while they were trying to access aid. The health ministry and witnesses reported that the total number of people who have been killed seeking humanitarian assistance is more than 200 people, with more than 1,500 people wounded. On Tuesday, 17 Palestinians were killed, and then dozens others were wounded. And much of this has to do with the distribution by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is supported by Israel and the United States. There were supposed to be 4 distribution sites. Those have been shut down over numerous days at various different times because of deaths and killings at those distribution sites or nearby. On one day this past week, according to witnesses, both Israeli forces and Palestinian gunmen fired at Palestinians that were heading to, this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation aid site, and that was in Rafah. I would point you to, and we can share this, but the Friends Committee for National Legislation has put a fact sheet together about the Global Humanitarian Foundation, and I would really encourage you to take a look at that. The former director of it resigned because of the problematic nature of the way that the foundation is so directly connected to Israel. And so the idea of, a state that is attacking a people group being responsible or contributing to those who are actually delivering aid that is needed for the basic necessities of life is at minimum a violation of international humanitarian law. On Monday, in 24 hours, 46 people were killed, 388 people were wounded, and the death toll in Gaza as of Monday was 54,927 people. So by now, that's more than 55,000 people killed. And those numbers are still believed to be very conservative because of the number of people who are still dead underneath rubble, or the number of people who were not killed directly. They were wounded in an airstrike and then died later. Those types of numbers are not included in that death toll. On the second day of Eid al-Adha, this was over the weekend. It was one of the deadliest attacks, again, at an aid hub. 8 Palestinians were killed. Al Jazeera reported that day that more than 70 people died in Gaza and were killed, including an attack on a family home that killed 16 people just in one home. And members of the civil defense in Gaza said that day was a full-fledged massacre. The rate of children in Gaza suffering from acute malnutrition has more than tripled since just the beginning of the year, according to data from humanitarian groups. And after the 2-month ceasefire broke down in March, when Israel blockaded aid supplies for 11 weeks, that prompted a famine warning from a global hunger monitor. And I just wanted to share the rate of, out of 50,000 children under 5 who were screened, the rate of acute malnutrition has increased. It's now around 5.8%, whereas in early May it was 4.7%, and in February it was 3 times less. And so you're seeing the rate of acute malnutrition just drastically increase, as the weeks go by. A Palestinian minister said that there were 29 starvation-related deaths among children and the elderly in just a few-day period over the last month. On Monday, Hamas denied accusations that they had threatened workers of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and that they had prevented aid from being distributed. And international sources are reporting the reality of the scarcity of available humanitarian assistance. There are very few places to get food. The new GHF, has 4 distribution points, if they're even open, whereas previously, when the UN was responsible for coordinating food distribution, they had 400 locations where sites where people could go to get assistance. A UN spokesperson yesterday said that the minimal supply of flour the UN has been able to bring into Gaza in the last 3 weeks has mostly been looted by armed gangs or taken by starving Palestinians. In a report that was released this week, Israeli security forces, this is a report that was released by the UN that says Israeli security forces have committed a crime against humanity of extermination by killing civilians sheltering in schools and mosques. The report finds that Israeli security forces committed the war crime of directing attacks against civilians, that the conduct of the Israeli security forces amounts to a war crime of willful killing. On Sunday, the IDF announced the Israeli military had recovered the body of the de facto Hamas leader, Mohammed Sinwar, the brother of the former head of the military of Hamas, who also was killed. And that was recovered in a tunnel underneath the European hospital in South Gaza, according to the IDF. And within the last week, the military said that it had recovered the bodies of 2 Israeli-American hostages from South Khan Yunis in South Gaza. Israeli security sources also recovered the body of a Thai citizen who was taken hostage during the 2023 attacks. He was reportedly killed not by Hamas, but by the Mujahideen Brigades, which is a small militant group in Gaza. There was a recorded speech from the current head of Hamas last Friday that said that the group was not rejecting the most recent U.S. ceasefire proposal, but instead was demanding some remarks. That was the word they used for edits, and that they wanted to ensure that there would be an end to the war before they signed a peace agreement. Doctors in Gaza are donating their own blood in order to be able to save patients because there's no blood supply available. And this is after dozens of Palestinians have been killed seeking food aid. And so that's just a small snapshot of what's continuing in Gaza day by day. In Yemen, the Israeli Navy Tuesday said it struck Houthi targets at the Red Sea port of Hodeidah. Israel alleged that the rebel group has used that port to transfer weapons. And in Lebanon, in the past week, the Israeli military struck Hezbollah's drone factories in South Lebanon and the suburbs of Beirut. Again, that's according to the Israeli military. The strikes came on the eve of Eid al-Adha. And so one of the conversations in the Muslim world was about the sacredness of that holy day and about how, Muslims around the world were seeking pilgrimage and were on Hajj, and there were acute attacks in South Lebanon and also in Gaza. Late last week, related to Syria, a BBC Arabic team, which had left Damascus and was planning a trip to the Golan considered an occupied territory by Israel. They were detained by Israeli forces. They were blindfolded, strip searched, and threatened. The officer threatened us with worse consequences if we approach the frontier from the Syrian side again. They said that they know everything about us and would track us down if any hidden or undeleted photos were ever published. Now, there's a lot happening in relationship to Iran. And one of the things that we hear is the vast majority of Israelis support Israel having they would consider it a preemptive attack on Iran to prevent them from achieving nuclear capabilities. Late last night at about 9:30 East Coast time, the White House press put out a breaking report saying that U.S. officials have been told that Israel is fully ready to launch an operation into Iran. This is a part of the reason the U.S. advised some Americans to leave the region. That just came out in the last 24 hours. And the U.S. anticipates Iran could retaliate on certain U.S. sites in Iraq if Israel does attack. Now, Steve Witkoff is planning a meeting with Iran still, which would be the 6th round of talks between the U.S. And Iran on Sunday. President Trump on Monday had a phone call with Prime Minister Netanyahu. One of the main points of discussion was Iran. President Trump said he believes there's a chance of reaching a nuclear deal and that for now he opposes military action. But even since Monday, in the last 4 days, we've seen a lot of movement in this regard. On that phone call, Trump said he's trying to avoid death and destruction. The call came as Trump has been trying to accelerate aid into Gaza. According to reports, we're not seeing any fruit of that effort. But while also the U.S. has been trying to persuade Iran to give up their nuclear program. Now, Tehran's defense minister said yesterday that Tehran will counterattack. And it's been interesting that Iran has not been talking about counterattacking Israel. They've been talking about counterattacking U.S. bases, that Tehran will strike U.S. bases if nuclear negotiations fail and if conflict between Iran and the U.S. arises. The U.S. head of Central Command, General Michael Kurilla, told a congressional hearing this week that the U.S. Army has presented Trump and Defense Secretary Hegseth with a wide range of options on how to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran. President Trump and Netanyahu in that conversation also on Monday, Trump warned Israel not to attack Iran unless negotiations with the U.S. fail. Now, Trump's message to Netanyahu was, this is not the time to escalate the situation while he's trying to resolve other issues. And so President Trump encouraged Netanyahu to act cautiously. Some updates from Israel. Netanyahu confirmed this past week in a bid to foster local opposition to Hamas in Gaza that Israel is and has been arming a small Palestinian militia that controls territory in the south of the Gaza Strip. So this came out, it came out because there was a leak in the Israeli government, but many thought that Netanyahu would deny it. And instead, the Netanyahu government and his office have confirmed Israel's supporting local militant opposition. And the comment that came from the Netanyahu office was that it's because it saves the lives of Israeli soldiers. I'd call your attention, and we can also share this link. There's a group called Law for Palestine, which has compiled more than 500 statements of Israeli incitement to genocide. They've amassed a compelling body of evidence that exposes the proliferation of incitement to violence and genocidal intent perpetrated by Israeli officials, public figures, and others against Palestinians. This documentation has more than 500 incidents that appear in forms of social media, TV interviews, official statements from Israeli politicians, army personnel, journalists, and other influential personalities. Law for Palestine says this about their conclusions. These reprehensible incitements have been characterized into significant thematic areas, including genocidal intent, forced displacement, and collective punishment. What makes this evidence all the more disconcerting is its origin emanating from the upper echelons of Israeli government, including the president, prime minister, Knesset members, military personnel, and law enforcement. So that database is available for you to review. Law for Palestine says they're resolute in their commitment to combat the impunity that Israel enjoys, to work to bring an end to the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people. Together, let us stand united in the pursuit of justice and the cessation of atrocities against the Palestinian people. Also in Israel, the Knesset is targeting Palestinian rights NGOs. There is a bill that will impose an 80% tax on funding that's allocated by foreign states to civil society organizations. You probably know that many of the Israeli human rights organizations and others, their main bodies of funding come from foreign entities. The measure primarily targets groups that are opposed to the war in Gaza and the occupation of the West Bank. Now, on Sunday in Israel, this coming Sunday, this has not happened yet, there'll be a very important vote that's related to the conscription of the ultra-Orthodox in the Israeli military. Netanyahu's government faces possible collapse as opposition has moved to dissolve in the Knesset. So there was a major test this last Wednesday after the opposition to Netanyahu's government submitted a bill to dissolve the parliament. This is with his ultra-Orthodox coalition partners threatening to support that measure and to force early elections. Ultra-Orthodox parties are furious that the government has failed to pass a law that exempts their community from mandatory military service, which in the past, the ultra-Orthodox have been exempted from service. This issue has long divided the Israeli public, especially during the 20-month war in the Gaza Strip. Many expect a last-minute compromise, but the vote is the most serious challenge to Netanyahu's government since October 7th, 2023. The bill must pass another 3 readings before the parliament would be dissolved. And so this process could take days or it could take weeks. And just to note that it's about 8 weeks until the Knesset has a summer recess. And so some analysts are saying that the ultra-Orthodox are using this bill as a bargaining chip to improve their positions in negotiations related to these conscription questions. I wanted to let you know and call your attention to the reality that while Israel has been fighting in Gaza and the atrocities that have been happening in Gaza, Israel sold more weapons to other countries in 2024 than they ever have before in their history. So even while fighting on multiple fronts in South Lebanon and Syria, certainly in Gaza, Israel has sold more weapons than in previous years. And one of the arguments that's often made about Israeli weapons is that they're tested, they're field tested. And the argument has been asserted that the Palestinian people suffer because of that testing, and that sometimes perhaps weapons are used more readily than they would be otherwise in order to increase the saleability, of munitions. I will also, I think that's probably enough on that. So I wanted to shift to the United Nations. There's a very significant meeting happening in New York next week. This is the UN Peace Summit that is being hosted by the Saudis and the French. Earlier in the week, it was reported that the conference that was going to focus on recognition of the Palestinian state was going to, quote, weaken the scope of its ambition. So that report came out. The UK, France, and other Western states will not recognize Palestine in New York. Instead, they will focus on steps to take, what steps might be taken towards that end. So this article was quite significant. But then in the last 24, 48 hours, French President Macron's office said that those claims about stepping back from the ambitions of the conference were not true. One of the things that's really important to understand is if recognition moves forward, the conversation within the Israeli government is that large-scale annexation would be the consequence. And it could be annexation of parts of Gaza and or the occupied West Bank, but large-scale annexation would be the response. French President Macron's office also said they'd received a letter from the Palestinian Authority that contains concrete and unprecedented commitments to reform. This includes a call for Hamas to no longer rule Gaza, to hand over weapons and military capabilities. A source from the French president's office said that Paris is moving in the direction of recognizing a Palestinian state. And again, that refuted the reports that France was retreating from that action. Now, the United States has warned other countries to not join France, and the US and Israel are essentially boycotting that UN conference next week, stating that the conference is supporting our enemies. The US is lobbying foreign governments not to attend. They sent a cable out on Tuesday that says the actions taken at the conference are going to be anti-Israel, and attending the conference would be viewed by Washington as acting against U.S. foreign policy interests. France is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It's also a U.S. ally in NATO. Saudi Arabia is one of the United States' closest Middle East partners. And so we all know President Trump went to the Middle East. He was feted during a May visit to Saudi Arabia, where also billions of dollars of deals, investment deals with the U.S. Were signed during that trip. France and Saudi Arabia are, in response to that UN summit, the quote was, "The U.S. opposes any steps that will unilaterally recognize a conjectural Palestinian state, which adds significant legal and political obstacles to the eventual resolution of the conflict and could coerce Israel during a war, thereby supporting its enemies." Ambassador from the U.S. to Israel, Mike Huckabee, said that a Palestinian state in the occupied West Bank is no longer a goal of the U.S. government. He said Israel's Muslim neighbors should give up land to create one, meaning a Palestinian state. I'm thinking I should consolidate some of the updates I have because I know our time is short. A lot of things happening in the international arena in terms of responding to what's happening in Gaza, but also the broader conflicts in the Middle East. The UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Norway announced that they're sanctioning Israel's far-right National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir and Finance Minister Smotrich over their inciting of violence against Palestinians in the West Bank, and that this cannot be seen in isolation from the catastrophe in Gaza. I'm sure you also heard this week that the international activists aboard the Freedom Flotilla, the Madeleine, attempted to break the siege on Gaza. They were taking a symbolic amount of food and humanitarian assistance. They were attempting to into Gaza via sea, but the Israeli army took control of the flotilla overnight into Monday, and then brought activists, detained, arrested the activists. This included Greta Thunberg. The activists were taken to Ashdod in the south of Israel. The foreign ministry said the activists were safe and unharmed. They were expected to return to their home countries. Defense Minister Israel Katz is said to have instructed the army to show the passengers the videos documenting the atrocities that were committed by Hamas during October 7th. And it wasn't until Tuesday when Greta Thunberg and others, or late Monday, when they departed Israel via Tel Aviv. There were at least 5 other activists detained by Israeli forces during that process. After that, which was meant to somewhat coincide, there was a convoy of buses and private cars that departed for Gaza from Tunisia. And so there are groups of activists in different parts of the world that are seeking to make efforts over land or by sea. The Tunisian civil society groups behind the convoy said their aim was to demand the immediate lifting of the unjust siege on the Gaza Strip and to bring an end to the 20-month war between Israel and Hamas. The U.S., a week ago, in an unprecedented move, the Trump administration imposed sanctions on 4 of the judges of the International Criminal Court. The U.S. Treasury Department imposed sanctions on Addameer, which is a major Palestinian legal group that works on behalf of prisoners and detainees. There were 5 other charitable entities across the Middle East, Africa, and Europe that were also sanctioned. White House staffing has shifted. Now Wayne Wall is the new senior director for the National Security Council. And also Wessam Hassanin was appointed to the Vice President Vance's office as an advisor on the Middle East. He previously had worked at the State Department under Michael Anton. Speaking of state, they are considering allocating $500 million, $500 million for the funding of U.S. and Israel-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. I've not heard if that is confirmed yet, but that has been considered. And in Colorado, Boulder, the man accused of yelling "Free Palestine" and then firebombing demonstrators, calling for the release of Israeli hostages in Gaza was charged this week with 118 counts, including attempted murder. Last night, this was also late last night, the evangelical Johnny Moore, who's the executive chairman of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, refused to reveal who funds it. He said, based upon what I know, this is an independent initiative that's not funded by the Israeli government, which is, of course, the significant concern, especially since more than 200 people have been killed near those distribution sites. And so he was talking about the efficacy of aid being delivered, which of course is quite contested. There are some things being raised at Congress. One of the most significant is the resolution called Block the Bombs Act, which currently has 22 House members supporting it. The bill would stop the transfer of certain offensive weapons to Israel and ensure Israel is in compliance with U.S. and international law. And I would call your attention to a Prayers for Peace blog that CMEP published. It was written on Pentecost Sunday by the ecumenical leadership in Jerusalem called the Jerusalem Voice for Peace. It includes the former Latin Patriarch Michael Sabah, His Excellency Greek Orthodox Bishop Atala Hana, His Grace Lutheran Bishop Munib Yunan. So I'd call your attention to that as well. And if you've not yet taken action, CMEP has posted letters to Gaza on our website. We'd encourage you to consider joining us in that. The March to Gaza, a 3-day peaceful march in Egypt to the Rafah border, is happening June 12th to 15th. And so we're watching closely what happens with that at their website. And just as we're reflecting on Pentecost Sunday this past week, the reminder that the Holy Spirit was sent as a comforter to remain with us as a promise from God. And so may that be an encouragement to us in the midst of all of these abundant catastrophes. So may God go before us.